Okay, it's kind of an expectant silence. I was told this event was going to run, kind of more European type timing, so I think we're good, kind of hour ahead of schedule. All right, so we're here. My name is Hal Weitzman. I'm the editor-in-chief of Chicago Booth Review, and also teach a class here on persuasion. And we're delighted to have been involved in a very, very gentle way in helping to launch Capitalisn't, the new podcast from the Stigler Center. This is a congratulations to both of you. This is a fun, lively, interesting, scholarly podcast. You don't often hear those words together, and you don't hear some of those words at all at the University of Chicago. But it's really entertaining. I encourage all of you to listen to the first 4 episodes of the podcast. It feels very light, but it's actually quite rich. I noticed normally I listen to my podcast while I'm washing up or similar kind of activity, changing diapers. But in this case, I actually had to stop doing that and concentrate very hard because there's a lot there, and I had to keep going back and listen to points that I had missed. No, I think that's a good sign, because I think it means that you really have to concentrate. I'm sure if I were in the gym, which I'm not, that would be a good place to do it. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, rather than the kind of formal University of Chicago introductions, which could take us an hour, let's just have you introduce yourselves, and then maybe tell us, how did you meet?
Sure. I don't think a formal introduction of me would take very long. Since I'm a baby professor, I just started as a professor, but I am an assistant professor technically at Georgetown University. I'm at McDonough, which is a school of business, and I teach a finance class, but I also have a courtesy joint appointment with the law school at Georgetown. And I do research in bankruptcy, which we haven't talked about on the podcast yet.
Okay. Luigi?
And I'm Luigi Zingales. I'm a faculty here. I teach finance, and I've been here 25 years.
Okay, so how did you meet?
So we have different stories. Why don't I start
with
my stories?
Yeah.
So she was on the job market last year. And when somebody comes on the job market, generally gives a seminar, and then talks
the job market, just to explain, means you've completed your PhD, or just almost completed,
yeah.
And you're shopping yourselves around.
Yeah, it was exactly a very formal job market in a way that very few markets are like that. And it says, in this season, I just came back from the meeting. There is a meeting of the American Economic and Finance Association, and all the PhD who was trying to get a job applied for the various schools. So there is this first round of interview, and then if you do well in the interview, you are invited on campus. So if you watch out in the next few weeks, you're going to see a lot of people coming in and giving seminars here. Those are sort of young graduating PhDs who present their stuff, and then they spend a day on campus, they meet with the faculty, and then they go out to dinner, okay? And then generally, this is pretty gruesome, because in one day, you meet a lot of people, you give a seminar.
What's the gruesome part, the seminar or the dinner?
No, and everything, including the dinner, because the dinner, you arrive and you're pretty exhausted after a pretty intense day, and so we group of us take Kate to dinner, and at dinner, she mentioned the fact that she wanted to do a podcast, which I have to say, from a sort of getting a job, is not exactly what you should say.
It's like if you went to an investment banking interview, and it's, you're there for like the sell day or whatever, and they're like, well, how are you going to spend most of your time in the office? And you're like, well, I'm going to be working on my podcast. Like, that wouldn't reflect very well on you if you brought that up. And similarly, it was like a really dumb idea for me to bring it up.
But two things. One is, I've been thinking about starting a podcast, and I want to find a partner for that enterprise. And I instantly like Kate, because having the courage to say that is sort of quite bold. And so I said, number one criterion, she's bold, that's good. But I had to wait for the market to clear, because to be honest, had she become had she hired here, I would not have approached her to start a podcast, because I'm a senior faculty and I cannot ask anything from a junior faculty, which is at all.
Because we want people to concentrate on their research,
absolutely,
not on...
Yeah, and we're very careful of not sort of abusing the power that comes from senior to junior. So I think that because she did not get hired here, then
that was great for
job. It was great for the podcast. I reach out.
I don't know what I'm supposed to say about this. Like, either way, it's going to be a bad answer, so I'm just going to keep mum.
So I reach out to her and I said, I started by saying, I'm not so sure this is great for your career. I have to say that because I'm still a senior member of the profession, and so I don't want to mislead you into this. But I want to sort of start a podcast. Are you interested? And she said, yes. I'm a superwoman.
Yes.
I'm a superwoman. I can do everything.
I didn't say that, yeah.
And she is. So I think that's fine.
Well, what's your version of the story, Kate?
Oh, I mean, my version of the story, it was the right story. Same story. Basically, I was just so, like, the job market's so bad because you wake up at, like, 5:30, and then you have to go to breakfast with the professor, and they ask you all these tough questions, and you meet, like, everyone in the department for half an hour, then you give your presentation of your research for an hour and a half, which did not go well for me here. And then you meet with a bunch of other people for like another 5 hours, then you go to dinner for like 4 hours. And so I was just so exhausted and out of it at that point that I couldn't really pay attention to what was going on. By the way, is that for me? Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Also, I got really drunk, which is what I'm going to do now because I'm nervous. So this is part of the problem. But I
suddenly turned into the second hour on Good Morning America. Kathy leaves. Yeah.
I accelerated a bit. I told myself I've always wanted to have a podcast just because I love podcasts so much. Like at the time I was listening to like 8 or something. And it's just always been a dream of mine to talk about anything on a podcast. I wanted it to be something like monetary policy so I could learn about something new. And I was like, whatever you do with these dinners, do not mention a podcast. Like, don't mention it. And I was just so wound up that I blurted it out. And I didn't mean to, but I did. And fortunately, it worked out okay, because Luigi's a great person to work with. But in the moment, I was definitely like, oh no, like this kind of seals my fate for not getting a job here. But it worked out okay. And I'm happy with the course that it took.
Okay, so why have you been keen for so long to start a podcast?
I don't have a great answer other than I love podcasts.
What are the podcasts that you listen to?
Gosh, I listen to a ton. I mean, recently we've been so busy trying to launch this thing that it's fallen off a bit, but I used to listen to like Marketplace every day, listen to Political Gabfest, which is one of my favorites, Planet Money, and some of the other Slate podcasts like Amicus and The Weeds, and I listen to Chapo Trap House. Are there any like socialists in the audience? This is the wrong
great
place.
Question.
This is the wrong place to be asking that question.
They feel like you're going to ask them to leave.
I think a lot of people think this is a socialist podcast because it's called Capitalisn't, and we're not. But I do listen to a socialist podcast called Chapo Trap House. But anyway, I love them a lot. But I felt like there were still some issues that I wasn't getting answers to. And I was like, oh, I know the answers to these questions. I want to be able to provide them.
I just fell in love with Planet Money. Planet Money is fantastic. And I actually now assign it in some of my classes, some things, because they're very good. And I think to me, it was the first time I heard anything, either articles or in the journalistic world, that is well done from an economic point of view. The only thing of Planet Money is by being NPR, they're very ascetic. They don't come out with sort of an answer. They try to present both sides. They are, in a sense, too balanced. They don't have a point of view. And so I thought that there was room for a podcast with a point of view. And, of course, we cannot do narrative stuff because the cost is enormous. And so Planet Money, I just listened to 2 episodes on demonetization of India, for example. They're fantastic, but they send people to India to interview people. We don't have that kind of budget here.
You just interview Raghu.
Yeah, I could just do Raghu and do it in-house. But I think that there is room. In the political world, there are a lot of discussion-based podcasts. And in economics, I don't think there is any. And so we say, why don't we give it a try?
And you kind of fulfill that role of, going, new podcasts need to go very deep into a subject. So I feel like that's what I was trying to say at the beginning. But you do that, you go very deep into a subject. It's not superficial.
I think that we don't want to be superficial. I think that our comparative advantage is not to be superficial.
Sure.
So we want, I want to make
As they say, deep down, we're all superficial.
deep down, we're
Did
all
they say
superficial.
that? I said that.
It's a wry comment. Obviously, it didn't go over too well with the
It was too deep.
I prefer what you were saying.
No. I'm just saying that I think that I see the podcast as also a trial on how to use new communication means to do a mission of the school. The mission of the school is to produce and diffuse knowledge. And I think that we are excellent on the production side. I think we can improve on the diffusion side. And I think that the podcast is just another way to do it. So we'll see how it works, but that's the goal.
Okay. Kate, who's the target audience for this podcast?
The target audience is people who listen to podcasts. I don't want to rule anybody out, but so we've been doing a little bit of advertising recently, and you can advertise like anything on Facebook. You can advertise just a picture of yourself on Facebook if you feel like it. You just have to pay like $1, and it will show you the outcome of who listened and looked at your post or whatever. So I've been doing a little bit of this for our podcast, and it's a very well-defined audience. So I think it's between the ages of 25 and 36. Who definitely listen to podcasts. Like, if we market to 22-year-olds, it's just wasted on them. Because you need to kind of get into the workforce a little bit, start becoming more interested in, like, broad ideas. Out of college, I think it's a little too stressful. And so the ages 25 to, mid-30s are definitely the main target. And then men listen to podcasts slightly more than women, but not by a whole lot. So, obviously, both genders. In fact, I think part of this is that I'd like to get women more involved in podcasts.
Okay. What are the kind of the goals? So if you have your audience somewhat well defined, what do you want them to do once they've listened to the podcast?
I think the goal is for them to understand better what's happening in the economic world. My impression and my experience now is for my kids, because my kids belong to that generation, and they don't necessarily take very many classes in economics in college. Then they go out in the workforce, and they are faced with a lot of issues and challenges. And I don't think they're well prepared even to understand what's happening. And so I think that we have a comparative advantage in trying to explain to them what's happening. And we try to do it in a way that hopefully is appealing to them. The world, in my view, is divided into two. The one who listen to podcasts and generally listen to a lot, and the one who don't, they don't even know what they are. And generally is very highly correlated with age. But even if you're very young, you don't listen to podcasts. People listen to podcasts when they exercise, when they commute, and when they do chores at home, including walking the dog. Okay, those are the activities. And if you are below 25, you tend not to do those things.
Exercise.
The exercise you do, you play with other kids. It's not.
The irony is you should be walking the dog because you promised you would, but you aren't because your dad is doing it.
Yeah, right. You know that.
That's helpful, right?
I would add one thing to that. So one of the things that got me wanting to do a podcast was that about a year ago I was out at a bar with someone with a PhD in physics and a friend who's a DJ. And we're having this conversation. They were like, "Oh, can you resolve like this question for us?" Which is, what does it mean to like participate in the stock market? It's so arbitrary. It goes up and down, and like you can't figure out which way it's going to go. But what does it mean to own stock? And I was like, you own a piece of the company. You own your rights to the cash flows of that company. And they were like, "What do you mean? That's not true." And I was like, "Yeah, it's true. If that company makes money, then like a share of that money belongs to you." And you guys all know this because you're at a business school. But they were like, "That is not what it means to own stock. Like, if that company makes money, I'm not going to get any of that money." And I was like, "Yeah, no, it's returned to you through dividends or like there's share repurchases." And they were like, "No." This was
the PhD in physics or the DJ?
Both of them.
Okay.
Both of them were equally skeptical. And then the PhD in physics was like, "Yeah, but like stock buybacks are evil, and so that's not a good way of returning money." And I was like, "Okay, we need to clear some stuff up. We need a podcast." And so I do think that there's like. I think that there are some pretty basic issues in finance, corporate finance, as well as economics that could use some clarification.
Have you checked back with them?
They still don't get it.
Okay.
But we haven't had our episode on that yet.
So tell us a little bit about the process. How scripted are these? How much do you talk about what you're going to say beforehand?
So we have experimented a bit back and forth, and I'm not sure that we have reached the perfection yet. We're still a work in process, and we love your feedback on that.
Yeah.
But the idea is to have a discussion, converge on what we're going to discuss about, also the limit of a topic, because of course some topics go, they are infinitely broad, and so if you don't limit what you're going to discuss, you talk like in two sort of different direction. But once we have that, and some common references, academic and non-academic, then we want to do it sort of spontaneously, not pre-arranged, because I think that's more fun and comes better. And then there is Derek. Actually, where is Derek? Here, I saw him.
Like sitting right there.
Yeah,
Derek's our fantastic.
Raise your hand. Good. Derek is our producer. He then sort of cut and paste to make it sound like perfect.
Perfect.
So how much editing? How much editing is involved? Is it basically just what they said, or is
Derek,
it?
be careful what you say. I will.
But seriously, are we getting? Do you record? You know, they're 20 minutes long. So do you record half an hour, or how do you do it?
Well, no, so far they've been like 27 minutes long. We planned on having it be 25
like
to, yeah, it just comes by so fast. We record for usually like over an hour and a half. And so it gets distilled down quite a bit.
Okay. All right. And how often are you going to do these? So you've got the first 4 out. What's the plan?
We got a couple in our back pocket.
Uh-huh.
The plan is for them to come out every 2 weeks. And I would love for that to be more. I mean, it would be better if it were once every week. And depending on how it goes, I mean, maybe that would be a good investment of our time in the future. But it takes a lot to prepare for each episode. I mean, Luigi, Luigi's written books on this stuff, and so he kind of just wakes up in the morning and starts recording. But I need to spend like 24 hours preparing for each episode because it's tough. So it would be a lot to do it every week.
And do you envisage it would be the same format all the time, the two of you, or is one of you going to take a break and bring in, or are you going to bring in guests, or how are you going to do
think we're going to bring guests, but we would like to be just the two of us as sort of the key co-host, also to develop a sort of reputation, and people they know what to expect, and my impression is we get better as we go along, so we want to exploit this in learning by doing.
Okay.
Yeah, someone the other day asked me if I was Luigi's assistant. And I was like, no, I'm the co-host of the podcast. And then their follow-up question was, well, how are you going to get people to listen by bringing on famous people? And I was like, no, it's just me and him. That's the whole idea. And they were totally skeptical. But, hopefully listening to us is interesting enough for now.
Okay, now you touched on this, but how do you get ideas for what you're going to talk about? Obviously, as you say, Luigi has lots of ideas. You're the one who kind of focuses him down to... That's sometimes how it works with Luigi. You have to focus him down to specific ideas.
He's difficult to corral. That is definitely true. There's so many ideas. I mean, we just got back from this meeting. Thankfully, I wasn't looking for a job this year. But this meeting where all the schools are interviewing candidates for jobs. And just on a daily basis, we're like, oh, we should do an episode on that. We should do an episode on that. I mean, there's just so many interesting papers coming out and research. There's so much going on with our economy at the moment. It's actually hard to pick which one to do, not to come up with new topics, at least for now.
The challenge is to understand what is the spin that average human beings are interested in. This is we tend to be interested in also more the techie side that most people don't care about. So the first screen is, can we sell the idea to Derek? We elected Derek as our normal human being. Because he's basically this target audience. He's young, college educated, doesn't know much about economics. So he's really sort of...
that was how the job description was written, actually.
And he has a sense, I should add, having been a journalist for a long time, he has a sense of sort of what is sort of cool or interesting and what is not. And so the first job is to sell an idea to him and see whether he...
So, Derek, you're the most important guy in the room.
Oh, 1,000%. Yeah.
Sorry, you were saying to sell an idea.
No, to sell it and see whether he bites and has an interest, and then if he does, then we start to see sort of what are the aspects and how to bring it so that we can capture the audience, and that's a challenge in which he helps us, but at the end of the day, we have to do a lot of the work, and I think that's also useful for teaching. It's not that different from trying to get attention from the students and trying to get attention from the listener. The difficulty is that the listener can switch off any minute. And so you have to.
Whereas the students are always completely engaged.
Absolutely.
All 3 hours.
At least they're physically there for an hour and a half. Maybe mentally not, but physically they're there. In a podcast, they can switch any moment.
Right.
Also, we've been getting some great ideas from listeners just in the past few days. Some stuff that I want to do that was suggested to us include like climate change and economics, as well as are we truly a capitalist society? Like how much of the United States, at least right now, is socialist, if at all? And there's just like great ideas coming out all the time. So if you have an idea for a podcast, please let us know. Okay,
and you said you recorded 2. You've got 2 extra episodes which you haven't released yet. So what are they about? Oh,
we can't tell you.
Can you not tell us the subject?
It's top secret. Should we say?
Sure.
Oh.
I mean, this is your audience.
When I create some expectation. So the first one.
The Fed one.
What?
The Fed one.
Yeah, the first one when I release is actually a very interesting story about whether there are some leaks of information from the Fed that benefit the stock market. And I give you like a little preview. One of the students, who's here probably, one of my students, PhD student, has done this phenomenal paper looking at cab rides in New York.
Right.
And showing that whenever there is a black period in the Fed means a period in which blackout period in the member of the Fed could not communicate anything with the outside because they have some inside information. You see an increase in the number of cab rides from financial institutions to the Fed, which is an indication that there is some flow of information. And other papers before have shown a remarkable correlation between the increase in the stock market and the release of information by the Fed. So I think that is a quite controversial story. Of course, at the Fed, they hate this idea and they find it preposterous. But actually, when you look through the list of, for example, journalists, you know that some journalists seem to know more than others in what happens at the Fed. Mm-hmm. And you wonder why.
Right. I don't know what you're suggesting there, Luigi. Okay. I never covered the Fed. I want to open this up so that you get a chance to ask our podcasters. What do you call yourself? Podcasters? Some questions?
Podcasters. That's good.
Yeah.
Who has a question for Luigi and Kate?
It can be ridiculous. It doesn't need to be on topic.
Yeah, over here. Thank you.
Wait a second. The microphone.
Yeah. Hey, Julian, second year. Can you elaborate on how you picked the name and why isn't at the end?
So we thought a lot about the name. Initially, actually, I fell in love with the name Follow the Money.
Which would have been a good name.
Yeah, because it's both historical, for those of you who don't know the story about the Watergate, the Deep Throat was saying to the journalist, follow the money. And also because one of my passions, of course, is to look at this corruption in the business and political war. So follow the money sounded like a great thing. Unfortunately, it was taken. It's an unknown podcast.
No, I think there's like a bunch of podcasts called Follow the Money. It was just a natural name.
And so that was out. So then we brainstormed a bit, and I think you came up with
Capitalisn't. I came up with a name, but I was with some friends, and I was asking them to like throw out different ideas. And someone said, Capitalism. I don't think that's going to work. But then I was like, but I like where your head's at. And then so I thought maybe we should play around with the ending. And then, Capitalisn't just popped up.
Which actually reminds me of something I was going to mention to you, is that both of you use profanities in the first 4 episodes. This is kind of a not necessarily completely family-friendly podcast all the time. Particularly you, Luigi.
I have to restrain in class. Let me be a little bit more free outside of class.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, it takes like all of my willpower not to swear constantly. I mean, if you're just like out with me on a regular basis, it's just like beep, beep. And so...
but I apologize. I
even
you talking about capitalism. That made me think about...
No, I mean, that's
one
pretty
suggestion.
light.
The one suggestion was capitalism. And then a friend came up with...
No, and then I was like, capitalism, capitalisn't.
Okay.
Even though we have this video trailer where we...
We've all seen the moment where it actually happened.
When that was actually how we came up with the idea. Yeah.
No, but I think that initially I wasn't particularly thrilled of the name, but what I like is the subtitle is what is working in today's capitalism and what isn't. I think that because I think represents fairly well what we want to do. Because other names that were floating, one name that was very cute was business casual. That I thought was a cute name, but does not represent what we want to do. I think that this is not a podcast about business.
Right.
Is a podcast about economics and our economic system. So I think that having the term capitalism in it is great, and also want to give the fact that we want to debate both sides of the issue. I think that unfortunately the world of media has become increasingly polarized along a political spectrum. And it's very difficult, in my view, to listen to something with an opinion, but it's not an opinion that is predetermined before you turn on the radio. And I think that what we try to do is try to do that. And it's just part of the back and forth that we have, is trying to simulate what the back and forth that we have in academic seminars. Here is more intense than other places, but it is a very healthy one because is intense, intellectually challenging, but also fair, which is something that we have lost trace in the debate. Because either you have two guys or two people on the same side, sort of screaming and complaining about the other political side, or you have like very intense debates on the two sides, but with no exclusion of any hit. And it's very rare to have an intelligent and constructive debate. And I think that many times at the end, Kate changes my mind and vice versa. I think
that never happens.
That's not true.
What did she change your mind on?
I think so the other episode we're working on is on the book by Piketty. And
that was supposed to be secret. That was an open secret.
She seems to be much more enamored of the book than I am, and I can see some of the positive aspects. I think that I think it's useful. That's true with all of my colleagues that the debate. I learn a lot, and I think that's no different.
Okay.
Also, going back to the title issue, Luigi definitely has a fetish for the word capitalism. If you didn't know that already, because like all of his books have the word capitalism in the title, and so I knew that even though he didn't like it at first, I would be able to convince him eventually.
Okay, and how has Luigi changed your mind, Kate, during one of these?
How has Luigi changed my mind? He does it in this very subtle way. He convinces me that I'm changing my own mind. I mean, when I went into this, I was very much like, inequality is the worst thing in the world, and I was like maybe borderline a socialist, but still trying to figure out a lot of my own ideas, and like very like pro-government and like pro-feminist movements and stuff, just like the typical liberal, I guess I would say, even though we don't want to bring like partisanship into this. And I think that like Luigi, through making a bunch of gradual points, he often ends up making me change my own mind by the end of the podcast, which already happened on a couple of podcasts.
So give us an example of where that happened.
So we had an episode on common ownership, which is out already, which is this issue of mutual funds are huge. They end up owning like entire industries. And so as a result, they may incentivize companies within those industries actually not to compete with one another. They don't want their portfolio companies to be competing, and so they may end up actually looking like monopolies. And this kind of like on its face sounds really terrible to me, right? Like monopolies are bad. We need to like break them up. Like we need more antitrust. But at the end of the episode, I found myself like defending free markets and defending like hedge funds. And I mean, I'm not saying that that's necessarily Luigi's point, but he often sort of has me think about all different sides of the spectrum.
Another question from our audience. Okay. Oh, here we have one down the front.
Wait, just 1 second. The microphone will come.
So as researchers and academics, like we study really narrow areas, right? And when we write papers, they end up being very narrow. How do you deal with topics where, I mean, we can read about other stuff and we can read other people's papers, but how do you sort of constrain yourself in the limits of talking about stuff that's not necessarily in your wheelhouse, or is this 24 hours thing, and that's just what it takes?
It's easier for me to answer that question
Please.
because, I mean, this is very much like your field. Luigi has had like a long and successful career kind of thinking about these issues. But for me, my very narrow focus right now, especially as a baby professor, is corporate bankruptcy. And that's not something we've talked about on an episode yet. That's not something we are planning on talking about anytime soon, even though it is like somewhat relevant to like the retail apocalypse we're experiencing right now. That's why I wanted to do a podcast, is partially it's a great learning experience. And one of the traps you can fall into as a junior professor at most places especially is that you end up being very deep but not very broad. And so for me, this was a way to balance that out. And you can often find yourself, there's so much incentive to just like churn out papers in your very narrow area, and it's hard to force yourself to learn about different issues. And so this, for me, was kind of like a mechanism to force me to learn more.
I think that's very wise. There is in academia a tension between saying nothing precisely or precisely nothing. And I think that unfortunately, much of the research is now pushing into the precisely nothing, because the standards of identification, of research, are so demanding that you end up focusing on a very, very narrow point, to the point that point is almost irrelevant. And I think that it's very wise of Kate to see this. You don't want to do that all the time, but forcing yourself to educate yourself on a broader perspective and thinking at the bigger picture is really something that not very many professors do, especially early on in their career life, and I think is very valuable. And I don't think that we are experts by academic standards on every topic we cover. I think that would be impossible. But let's look at the alternative. And it says most of the time these topics are dealt by journalists who know much less than we do, and they are less able to read the academic literature. I think that our comparative advantage is to be better able in understanding the academic literature and seeing also stuff before most people see it. And this common ownership episode is now becoming bigger and bigger. The OECD just in December had a meeting discussing the potential consequences of this, and the industry had already paid a few people to do studies to fight back on this finding. So it seems that it's gaining momentum, but you're not seeing this discussed in the standard press yet, because it's not arrived at. So I think that part of our advantage is also to be closer to the source of the production of this information, and so diffuse it earlier and hopefully in a more rigorous way.
That question also kind of highlights an issue you brought up earlier about the demands of academia, which are essentially don't do anything fun or frivolous, just focus on bankruptcy, and your corner of bankruptcy, and all this
that's
other
like
stuff.
The demand of having a job. Right? Like anyone is going to kind of be forced into a very specific area in their job. It's not just academia.
Okay, that's a fair point. I hadn't thought about it like that. But I guess there are some institutions, and I don't know Georgetown well enough, where being more of a public intellectual is sort of rewarded. At Chicago, I would say, Luigi, that's your choice to become a public intellectual. It probably hasn't helped your career much to do that. And there might be some cases where it might even harm your career, not in Luigi's case, of course, but It might, let's put it, as a theoretical possibility at least. So, so kind of, what's your motivation for doing this? In your case, so early on in your career, Luigi, I'm interested in what's your motivation now? I mean,
I'm worried about all the Georgetown people out there, like my bosses being like, you really have to focus on your research. Again, I mean, I don't think that this has much to do with academia. Like, imagine yourselves out there in the business world, doing investment banking, working on a trading desk. I mean, you're going to have to focus on something very narrow. You're going to have your product that you trade or your clients that you interact with. And there's always this feeling that, like, I want to have a broader sense of how the world works. I want to be involved in the public debate. And it's like, the further you get into your career, the harder it is to allocate that time. Yeah, and it's always going to be a trade-off, right? Like, you could spend that time calling clients or like setting up client dinners. You could spend that time digging further into your career, and it's a tough trade-off to make. I mean, when Luigi proposed the idea to me, it was like, oh yes, absolutely, because like the opportunity to work with Luigi in this capacity is something that I think like very few people at my stage in their career would pass up. But still, it comes with its costs, and it was a tough decision to make, and it just means that I'm going to have to work that much harder to produce research and to focus on my publication agenda, and hopefully I meet the mark, but we'll see.
Okay, and Luigi?
I think that I entered this profession honestly, to try to have an impact in the world, not to make money. I think a lot of people do that. Was not my agenda. Now, I don't mind the money, but it's not like...
That's talking about business school professors specifically.
First of all, why did I go into a PhD in economics? I think that that was my thing, and then to become a professor. And actually, I wasn't initially dedicated to go to a business school. I remember very distinctly the time was 26 years ago. I was in the job market, and at the time, the young assistant professor in business school in finance were getting $75,000 a year, and in economics was 42. Okay, and between 42 and 75, it's a huge difference. Okay, and I was going to market and interviewing with both sides, and the first business school I interviewed was actually Harvard Business School, and they told me this difference. But then they also had to seat me through one of their classes because they want to show like the typical Harvard Business School environment. And I remember to this day, the class was taught by a professor who was actually a PhD from MIT, where I was coming from, so I could see myself projecting the future. And the class was about People Express, an airline that failed many years ago. And he brought in the CEO, the former CEO of People Express, and when he came in, the students went up and down doing La Jolla, the wave. And, I was coming from a PhD at MIT where sort of, I remember Peter Diamond say, I have no time to waste for less prepared students. It was like a completely different, and I said, oh, this is the first time in my life where I'm faced with the choice of selling your soul. That you sort of, you can be a serious professor in economics for 42, or being sort of doing La Jolla in class for 75. What is the choice? And then sort of I got an offer from Chicago, at the time was GSB, and I added both. And then, so
how much was it for?
What?
How much was it for?
No, it was 75. Okay. So what was the business school salary, but as the seriousness of a economic department. And I think that that's what is the uniqueness of this place, is precisely the fact that it is a business school with the rigor and the seriousness of a department. So I never sort of planned to be a business school professor. I wanted to be a professor in economic and finance, and I ended up here.
But I was wondering about your choice to become a public intellectual, which most of your colleagues have not made. They would rather stay in their offices, deal with their PhD students. There are some obvious exceptions.
Sure,
Most people don't make that choice.
As I said, the choice is part of the motivation to be in this profession to begin with. And I actually, to some extent, sense a responsibility, because we have an enormous privilege that is called tenure, which to this day, I'm not even sure it's justified, except for one thing, that academic freedom, that allows you to say whatever you want without bearing any consequence of that. And it's so rare in any profession, and it's becoming even rarer today because people look, they're very careful because they want to have a political career, they want to have this other career, they are all this interest that are, and in the world of ideas, it actually used to be a world of public intellectual. Now it's much more of a professional sort of proselytizers that sell their little thing and are trying to, and there is not such a intellectual debate as it used to. And I think that we as professors have a responsibility in trying to keep it up and sort of challenge the conventional wisdom. And in this, Chicago is great. Chicago has always been very respectful of this, and in fact, is the idea that you go against the common wisdom is cheered, is not frowned upon.
So you talked about, when you both talked about impact in a slightly different way. And to go back to your friends in the bar, they, you know, if you achieve your goal of helping them understand what it means to own a stock in a company, is that enough, or do you want them to do something more? At various points in the first 4 episodes, I'm not going to use your language, but you challenge like Mark Zuckerberg and tell people that he shouldn't be a presidential candidate in 2020 and outline your reasons. And there are other things that people could do in the common ownership episode. You talk about things that people could do at the end. Is the idea that you change people's behavior, or change their thinking so they think more like an economist, or use some of the tools that you introduce?
To be honest, like, I don't really care how people's behavior changes at the end of this. I don't really have an agenda where I want people to go out and like act more in like a social justice sort of way. I just think that that's too grandiose. You know, that's like asking too much. I just want a little bit more of the discussion to be less like Trump gaffes. You know, like, I'm just sort of sick of that. And there's so much else to be talking about. And so to the extent that like people slowly start moving away from the memes, which are like fun, don't get me wrong, but like to some of the more serious stuff, and try and make the more serious stuff more fun. If I can do that, then like that's all I want.
Okay.
I don't see the two things as in contradiction. I think that there is a desperate need of getting people to think more. In a sense, she mentioned this Trump-esque thing, but also on the other side, look, there are a lot of things I don't like of the recent tax reform, but cutting corporate taxes was not a bad idea. You are hardly find any newspaper making that point, because if either you are pro-Trump or you're against Trump. If you're against Trump, you are against everything that he does in a way that I think is excessive. So finding a place where you can have that conversation, I think is useful, and my hope is that diffusing this and challenging will eventually, not next day, have impact on the way that the country is run. I don't think that our role as academic is to sort of run a party in one direction or the other, but it is to create ideas and create the intellectual space for people to actually bring new ideas. And I think there is a desperate need for new ideas in the political world, because I think that what we have doesn't seem to be very exciting.
On that note, Luigi, given that you were the person once cited by Sarah Palin, if we remember that name, the former Republican vice presidential candidate, as one of her 3 favorite economists, alongside Adam Smith and Milton Friedman. Now, that's a true story.
Wait, why are we laughing about this?
So, by the way, did you ever find out how she came to you?
I think that eventually I found who wrote her book, and I think that, but the thing that was interesting, and I think this is valuable, is that made me think why she quoted me, okay? Because the book had a bunch of very famous economists, and then a bunch of rock stars, and me, and I don't belong to any of the 2 categories. And most people could not spell my name correctly. In fact, I'm often Gonzalez rather than Zingales. So I think that it was stunning.
Start calling you that.
It was stunning that she sort of out of the blue, so much so that in the couple of weeks around the release of the book, they called me. They thought I was the economic advisor of Sarah Palin, and then sort of occurred to me, so why the one who wrote a book chose my name, and in part is wanted to show that Sarah Palin knew something outside of the mainstream. So precisely because I'm not like a household name, sort of seemed to suggest that Sarah Palin actually knew something that was good for her. But I think there was something a bit deeper, and that actually what pushed me to write my second book, Capitalism for the People, because some of my ideas are, if you want, a populist version of capitalism, which could be appealing for somebody like Sarah Palin, because she at the time had the characteristic that she was conservative, but hated by the establishment. And if you are hated by the establishment, you have nothing to lose by being a bit anti-establishment and more populist. All the other members of the Republican Party could not afford to do that because, as you know, there are the morning primaries in which you go to Sheldon Adelson and you get anointed by him. And if you have any vague resemblance of populism, you're out of the door the next day. So I think that there was something valuable there. And that sort of pushed me to write the book so that was clear that my version, at least, of popular capitalism was not exactly Sarah Palin, and I never heard from her again.
Did you actually hear from her in the first place?
No.
Oh.
I think what killed me is that I went to Fox. Fox immediately sort of interviewed me, and they asked me two questions. One, who did you vote for? And I said that I'm not a citizen, so I didn't vote. But if I did,
the headline was like Palin backs illegal aliens.
I'm not illegal, but honestly, had I voted in 2008, I would have voted Obama. So I think that that did not go very well with Fox. The second, they asked me about the so-called death tax, which is an inheritance tax, which actually I support. And so I used the line that I thought was pretty good, and I said, look, as economists, we know that you want to tax stuff that is very inelastic, because the more elastic it is, the more deadweight loss you have. So what is better to tax than death? It's completely inelastic, and so and that was the end of it. I've never been invited to Fox again, which, you know, I can happily live without, but it was interesting that it was so fast.
But that was just a kind of the first part of the question. I was going to ask you, given that happened to you, are you worried that, you know, given knowing another populist Republican candidate is in the news, are you worried that, well, the current president, I was thinking, are you worried that, like, you say things like, well, cutting corporate taxes is a good idea, I don't agree with everything, that might get taken out of context and suddenly they say, University of Chicago professor Gonzalez or Zingales is suddenly backing the tax plan?
Look, I'm kind of used to that because I've been in the public eye much more in Italy for many years.
Yeah.
And I've sort of advocated in different directions. And every time I do something, they sort of project me being here, project me there. And I think eventually people learn. And if you don't have an agenda, and it's just, if you do have an agenda, that's very costly because you don't want to be identified with one if you want to have a career on the other. If you don't have an agenda, you take the hit at the moment. If sort of, when people thought I was sort of the advisor, economic advisor of Sarah Palin, it was a bit sort of difficult, but you get over that, and people got over that. And those guys did not even know. You brought it up.
Well, I thought it was a funny
story. So no, that's perfectly fine. I survived, and I've been accused of being on both sides. So I think that it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is like still very early on for me to be exposed to this, like being taken out of context or, you know, having your words twisted in some way. I'm sure it's going to happen more as this podcast continues. But I did work on this paper when I was in college, actually, looking at like legalizing drugs. And I got hate mail once from someone saying that like I should die because in the paper we weren't taking into account the use of weed, the weed plant, in making rope in World War II. And like rope was really important, and like hemp can be an important component of rope, and therefore you guys are like terrible, and like you should be killed. And I think that was like an early exposure to just like, oh yeah, like people take stuff out, like people misinterpret things, and like they're, you know, things can get crazy. So you just gotta.
Are you against legalizing marijuana?
No, the point of the paper was that we should, but I'm just saying that like that is just so far out of left field that I was like, there's no way that even if we had expanded the scope of the paper, like that would not have been in the paper. but yeah, I mean, there's no way to like cover all your bases, so you just kind of gotta keep going.
Okay, very good. What more questions do we have? Okay, a couple over here. Thank you. Just wait for the microphones to come, please.
For guests, do you plan to bring on guests from more industry backgrounds or academic backgrounds?
More what background?
Industry. Or academic.
I think we plan to bring interesting guests. Actually, a little bit of promotion for the Stigler Center. In the 18th, we have a talk here of Duff McDonald, who is a no, he's not a professor, but is a writer who actually went after the value of MBAs and particular Harvard MBAs. So it would be an interesting debate that first I will have with him at the Stigler Center, and then will be a host in our podcast. I'm going to see how sort of it plays out, but I think it's very important because there is and this is part of what we want to do with the podcast, is not marginalize critics, but bring them in and confront them. I think that that's what the good educational value is about. This is what the tradition here at Chicago is about, and that's what we want to do.
Yeah, actually, I think this is a good opportunity to poll interest for that question. So, what's like a good industry name that people are interested in? Like Jamie Dimon? Does that count? Nods. Okay, so I'm saying some nods. Who's like a good academic not at Chicago?
Is there any?
Yeah. Okay, so like Rogoff and Reinhardt. So would you rather see us interview Jamie Dimon? Okay, so I'm going to ask you, Jamie Dimon or Ken Rogoff? Okay, so number one option, Jamie Dimon, just like raise your hand. Okay, number two option, Ken Rogoff, raise your hand. Okay, a little bit more for Jamie Dimon.
But
so,
actually,
yeah.
I'm impressed that there is so much demand for Rogoff. He's not the most... No, he's a great guy, don't take me wrong, but he's not exactly the most entertaining guy on the face of Earth. And actually, Jamie Dimon is very charming. I don't necessarily agree with everything he has done, but at a personal basis, I spoke with both. At a personal basis, Jamie Dimon is much more charming than Ken Rogoff. Sorry to say.
I don't know Jamie Dimon. But yeah, I mean, we'll try and get industry people on as well.
She had a question, yeah. Do you have the microphone? No. It's coming.
Yeah. Thank you, and I know we're getting close to one. It's actually a good wrap up. What advice would you give for somebody who's interested in starting a podcast?
Wow, I don't think that we have so much experience to...
You got to be successful before you can give advice.
But I think that advice number one is find a good producer. And actually, it's not easy because this is an industry that is booming now. So there are a lot of people that pretend to be producers, very few with a track record. And those with a track record are very difficult to get, like Derek. So it's not that easy to secure one. And I think that's very important. The other thing that actually she told me and a lot of other people told me, and it's true, is the quality of the sound is the most important thing. Because if you watch a movie, you can watch a movie with an okay sound. You cannot listen to a podcast with an okay sound. It's like unbearable. So I think that the quality of that is quite important.
But also, I mean, a podcast is sort of one of those arenas where you can actually just try it at a pretty low cost and see how it goes for you. You can't say the same for like an entrepreneur. You know, I can't just be like, yeah, you know, like start a boot company and see how it goes. Like there's like a lot of investment that goes into that. But for a podcast, you can buy like a decent USB mic on Amazon for like $90. You and a friend or, you know, like a coworker can sit down and talk for an hour or two. And then you can just see how you sound. I mean, I guess one of the things I learned is that like it's tough. If it's a discussion-based podcast, it's tough to like interact with someone because you're so focused on what you're going to say that it's hard to listen to the other person. So I would practice that a little bit, and if you sound like cool and funny at the end, then like keep going for it.
The other alternative is to be super, super specialized. So I listened to a few episodes of Unchained because I teach this class in FinTech. So there is this person who has this podcast. I don't think the podcast is great. But it's very informative. So you're willing to trade off. It's not entertaining. Lasts too long. And
is that blockchain? What is
yes, this is a journalist who is very knowledgeable of that space and brings a lot of, having a couple of computer scientists debate between themselves about the fork and whether it should be a hard fork or a soft fork is not exactly what you want as an entertainment, okay? Right. But there is content because she has good content in the industry. So she is very sort of focused. I think that is the alternative. Either you say nothing precisely but in an entertaining way, or you say precisely nothing but very precisely.
Okay. Jesse, on that note, I was going to ask, did you go to other people, like the Steve Levitt, the Freakonomics podcast? Did you ask people who've done it?
No, we actually had a conversation with Sarah Koenig, who is the one of Serial, who is an alumna from Chicago, and she was very, very kind, and she spent an hour with us on the phone, and was very helpful.
The initial plan was actually for it to be like more scripted. And she was like, you guys are going to sound terrible. Like, don't do that. And she was right. We tried one that was more scripted, and it just sounded very forced. And, like, so that was very helpful. But we didn't speak to that many other people aside from her.
Okay. Did I have one more question before? Okay. Well, Yes, so we do have one at the back here.
Thank you. Just wondering if there are any a narrative theme, any themes or a narrative thread that we should look for to develop from these podcasts as they go on? Is there anything you find happening now in terms of a narrative thread?
Hidden messages?
No, I think that the hidden message, which is not hidden, is what is working in capitalism and what isn't. I think that precisely because the debate is very polarized, people tend to either reject everything or celebrate everything and nothing can be changed. And I think that there are a lot of things that can be changed. You don't want to necessarily destroy the system. And I read actually yesterday that yesterday was a turning point in which the Berlin Wall was more down than up. So enough time has passed that since the Berlin Wall, then the time the Berlin Wall was up. So we are in a different world where I see my kids don't know a lot of the stuff. So you see Bernie Sanders that comes from the old-fashioned socialist, and they cannot put it in context. And I think it's useful to put it in context, whether you like or don't like what he says, but I think it's useful to put it in context. I think that's the purpose.
I think Luigi's going to talk a lot about Berlusconi in the next year, so that's all I got.
Are you having deja vu? Are you having flashbacks?
Oh, yeah, but I think there is two big differences people don't appreciate. Number one is Berlusconi, with all his defects, and I've been a big opponent, but with all these defects, he's actually a pretty funny guy. Okay, he started his career as an entertainer in big boards, so he's a pretty.
Whereas Trump is just very smart.
It's very stable. He's a genius,
but not very.
But he's not very likable. Okay. The other thing is, with all the defects of Berlusconi, is not a warmonger. So, and thank God, never had the finger on the nuclear
giant button.
Yeah. We can also.
I made a mistake by bringing Berlusconi up. Now he's like never going to stop talking about it. So.
Okay. Well,
we'll save it for the podcast.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a great discussion. Good luck with everything. Thank you very much for for doing this and telling us about it. And we're looking forward to hearing a lot more Capital Isn't.
Okay, one last thing, that whoever sort of rate us on the survey will get a free marks. Whatever you say, but you're going to get a free marks as a thank you note. And Simone will administer that.
Okay, excellent. All right. And thank you for your questions and comments.